Hey everyone, welcome back to MangaMinute. I'm thrilled to share my latest recap video with you. If you missed the previous one, no worries, just take a quick peek in the description below for the link. Now, let's dive right in and enjoy.
As Namgung Jin and Hajinyu walked through the expansive yard, a heavy silence hung between them, burdened by unspoken remorse and gratitude. Namgung Jin's steps were weighed down with guilt, his thoughts consumed by the consequences of his earlier actions. He believed he had failed in being decisive, his heart heavy with the shame of disappointing the Lord of Cheonhyejeong. Yet, despite the self-reproach that gnawed at him, he still stood firm, determined to remain loyal to Hajinyu, who had shown understanding in ways he could scarcely have imagined. Hajinyu, on the other hand, carried himself with quiet humility. His presence exuded calm, though inwardly, he felt undeserving of Namgung Jin's continued support. He had seen the lengths to which Namgung Jin had gone, and instead of anger or frustration, Hajinyu felt only gratitude for the steadfastness that had been shown to him. The burden of apology weighed differently on him, for he did not see himself as one to whom regret should be directed. In his eyes, Namgung Jin had acted wisely, and there was nothing more to be done but continue forward together. As they continued their walk, the tension between them seemed to ease, though the air remained solemn. Eventually, Hajinyu's gaze caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. His daughter, Somi, stood alone in the yard, her expression quiet but reflective. The absence of her brother was notable, and Hajinyu's thoughts turned to concern. He wondered why she was by herself and where her sibling might be. Eunho's thoughts drifted back to an old memory, a flicker of amusement crossing his features. He recalled a creature named Guwung, an unruly monster filled with an abundance of energy that seemed to manifest only in picking senseless fights. It had been a constant nuisance, challenging anyone within reach, its wild nature a thorn in Eunho's side. Unable to ignore it any longer, Eunho had taken matters into his own hands, restraining the beast and subjecting it to a hard-earned lesson that lasted several days. By the end of it, the once bothersome creature had transformed, as if its reckless antics had never existed at all. Guwung, no longer a threat, had seemingly learned its place. Now, as Eunho observed Peng Jael, who stood seething with rage, that memory surfaced vividly in his mind. There was a sharp comparison between the two, both brimming with unchecked energy and an unwillingness to back down. Eunho couldn't help but think that Peng Jael bore a striking resemblance to Guwung in those earlier, untamed days. A quiet calculation took place in Eunho's gaze, wondering just how much force would be necessary to instill the same sense of wisdom in this hot-headed opponent. Peng Jael stood before Eunho, his face contorted with fury, his voice seething with indignation at the audacity of being dragged into this confrontation. To him, the sheer arrogance of Eunho seemed boundless. His pride flared, and the words he hurled at Eunho dripped with contempt. But Eunho remained unfazed, his response filled with mocking laughter, the amusement clear in his eyes. To him, Peng Jael's bravado was nothing more than empty arrogance, born from ignorance. Eunho found it almost laughable, this man's understanding of power, his limited scope of the world above, as if he hadn't the faintest idea of the true vastness of the sky he spoke of. Lightning, Eunho mused inwardly, was the least of the dangers awaiting those foolish enough to soar without knowledge. Peng Jael's rage only intensified at Eunho's words, the insult cutting deep into his pride. Unable to hold back any longer, he released a surge of internal energy, the power rippling outward in an overwhelming display of force. His presence now radiated with an intensity that would have made lesser men tremble. It was clear, he was no ordinary warrior, far from the meek and predictable. His aura surged with a momentum that even Eunho found intriguing, a rare excitement flickering in his sharp gaze. Eunho assessed him silently, noting the impressive force behind the man's rising fury. This was no weak opponent, and for that Eunho was pleased. He thrived on challenges, and Peng Jael's strength promised anything but a dull encounter. The air between them crackled with tension, as the confrontation edged towards its inevitable climax. Peng Jael, his wrath uncontainable, vowed that merely crippling Eunho would no longer suffice. But Eunho, always a step ahead, mocked the delay, goading his enraged foe further. His casual taunts, delivered with a smirk, struck at Peng Jael's pride like a blade. If Peng Jael was ready to fight, Then why hesitate with words? The time for talking was over, now was the time to strike. Blinded by fury, Peng Jial charged forward, his body a blur of motion as he launched a powerful fist toward Eunho. Yet, as fast as his movements were, Eunho remained utterly composed. With a calm that bordered on indifference, Eunho sidestepped the attack with ease, his body moving fluidly, evading Peng Jial's assault as though it were nothing more than a gentle breeze. The gap between their skill levels became apparent in an instant, but to Eunho, the true test of the fight had only just begun. Peng Jial, frustrated by his inability to land a blow on Eunho, muttered under his breath, his pride unwilling to fully acknowledge the skill before him. He threw another punch, attempting to overpower Eunho through sheer force. However, before his fist could make contact, Eunho caught it with ease, his grip firm and unyielding. There was a mocking tone in the way Eunho regarded his opponent, as though Peng Jial's efforts were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Without breaking a sweat, Eunho toyed with him, subtly reminding Peng Jial of the clear difference in their abilities. His words carried a taunting undercurrent, suggesting that whatever training had shaped him into this form was far beyond Peng Jial's comprehension. Undeterred by the failure of his first strike, Peng Jial quickly followed up with another attack, swinging his other hand with the same determination. Yet, once again, Eunho's effortless evasion made it clear just how outmatched Peng Jial was. With a light leap backward, Eunho escaped the range of the attack, leaving Peng Jial floundering in his wake. Fury boiled in Peng Jial's veins, his temper flaring with each missed opportunity. He refused to let Eunho slip away, his eyes blazing with the intent to close the distance and make him pay. Eunho kept the gap between them with infuriating ease, his movements smooth and calculated. To Peng Jial, it was as if Eunho wasn't even taking the fight seriously. As he maintained the distance between them, Eunho's taunts grew sharper, laced with contempt. He seemed almost bored, as if the battle was nothing more than a tiresome game to him. Adjusting his clothing with a casual air, Eunho began to mock the reputation of the 24 Masters of Martial Arts, an elite group to which Peng Jial supposedly belonged. Eunho's eyes gleamed with amusement as he questioned whether someone like Peng Jial could truly stand among such legends. His opponent's attacks, though relentless, failed to impress him. Peng Jial's anger swelled at the insult, but the truth was undeniable. Eunho's effortless deflections and taunting words were a reminder that, despite his title and strength, he was facing a being far beyond the ordinary. An elder exclaimed as his gaze sharp and reflected on the current state of the martial world. In his mind, the names of Song Cheol Musean, Nakwang Jin Sechok, and Peng Jial surfaced, figures once rumored to be among the most prominent of warriors. However, a deep skepticism clouded his thoughts, and he found it hard to believe that these three truly deserved their place among the esteemed 24 martial arts masters. Another elder beside him nodded in agreement, sharing the same doubts. He observed how far behind these three were compared to the others, whose mastery had brought them to the pinnacle of martial perfection. While the 24 martial arts masters were celebrated for their unmatched skills in their respective disciplines, these three seemed to pale in comparison. The elder's thoughts shifted, considering how absurd it felt to group them with the true elites. Were they truly deserving of such a title? The two elders exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the disparity. It almost felt as though these three should be set apart, perhaps combined into a lesser group, one that reflected their current abilities. The three divine masters, a title that would emphasize their potential, but not place them on the same pedestal as the others who had long surpassed them. In a moment of quiet musing, one of the elders considered a more drastic solution. If these three no longer lived up to the legacy of the 24 martial arts masters, why not simply reduce the number? Perhaps it was time to strip away the pretense and acknowledge that only 21 warriors truly stood at the peak. Peng Jial's frustration boiled over as he faced Eunho, his voice tinged with both exasperation and disdain. He felt as though he had been far too lenient, sparing what he believed to be a young life from unnecessary harm. Yet, Eunho's continued defiance, the audacity in his gaze, only seemed to push Peng Jial closer to the edge. It was as though Eunho had been asking for death all along. Without warning, Peng Jial shifted into a stance he had honed through years of rigorous training, the indomitable resolve harmony stance. With a surge of internal energy, he unleashed a flurry of powerful strikes, each wave of energy crashing toward Eunho like a storm. The force of the attack was immense, tearing into the ground and sending shockwaves through the earth, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The battlefield, once unmarred, was now riddled with deep scars from the explosions that followed in the wake of his relentless assault. For a moment, Peng Jial allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction, his mind filled with the legacy of the Penga family's martial arts. Rooted in the military, their techniques carried the weight of generations tasked with the burdens of warfare. Their supreme strike, designed to kill with deadly precision on the battlefield, had been the pride of the family for centuries. To him, this was no mere fight. This was a testament to the resolve that had been passed down through the ages. Surely, such a devastating attack had ended the battle. As the dust began to settle, Peng Jial's voice echoed across the broken landscape, taunting the opponent he believed had fallen beneath the force of his power. But his confidence wavered when the dust cleared, revealing an unexpected sight. Standing unscathed in the same spot, as though the devastating attack had been little more than a breeze, was Eunho. His calm, collected stance seemed to mock Peng Jial's efforts, his figure untouched by the destruction surrounding him. Peng Jial's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. How could anyone survive such a powerful technique? The indomitable resolve was supposed to be an unstoppable force, spreading like rain to overwhelm any opponent in its path. Yet, here stood Eunho, utterly unaffected, his expression betraying neither pain nor weakness. For the first time, doubt crept into Peng Jial's heart, as he realized that this fight was far from over. Peng Jial stood in disbelief, his mind racing to comprehend the sight before him. He had unleashed his most powerful technique, the ultimate manifestation of the Penga family's martial arts legacy. And yet, Eunho remained untouched. Not a single one of his strikes had reached its target. His thoughts swirled in confusion as he tried to make sense of it. How could his techniques be so effortlessly neutralized? His eyes flicked to the sword Eunho now held, gleaming with an otherworldly energy, and realization struck him like a thunderbolt. The heavenly divine sword. He remembered the warnings from his subordinates, whispering that Eunho was no ordinary foe, a caution he had brushed aside. Now, as he stood before this figure who had not only survived but thrived against his ultimate technique, Peng Jial cursed his own arrogance. The words of praise he had once dismissed as exaggerations were now proving all too true. It couldn't just be skill, it had to be the power of that sword, something beyond the realm of ordinary martial arts. What kind of sorcery had this man used? Could it be that a mere merchant's son had risen to the ranks of the top martial artists, surpassing even those who trained their entire lives? Fury surged within him, the heat of his humiliation fueling his anger. He shouted, accusing Eunho of deceit, convinced that his opponent had concealed his true abilities to lure him into a false sense of security. The realization that he had been played, that his pride had blinded him to the true nature of this fight, only stoked the flames of his rage. Eunho, however, remained calm and composed, his hand steady on the hilt of his sword. His voice carried a tone of respect, though it was clear he had expected more from Peng Jial's ultimate attack. The overwhelming pressure from the strikes had been enough to force him to draw his sword, something he hadn't intended to do. Now that the blade was unsheathed, it would be a dishonor to put it away without first giving Peng Jial a demonstration of its true power. As Eunho shifted into his sword stance, a subtle, dangerous energy began to flow around him. He had made his decision. In return for the effort Peng Jial had shown, Eunho would reveal something that had never been seen before, the celestial blade dance. A technique long perfected, it combined 3 distinct sword styles, each with its own unique flow and elegance. It was a masterpiece of swordsmanship, a culmination of his years of training, and yet this would be its first appearance on any battlefield. Peng Jial, though still seething, couldn't help but feel a tinge of doubt creeping in. Even if this boy had reached the epitome of martial arts, he was still just a child, wasn't he? Surely, there was nothing he could show that would change the outcome of this battle. Yet, as Eunho prepared, a quiet confidence settled over Eunho, his blade gleaming in anticipation. Peng Jial felt the ground shift beneath him, though whether it was his mind or reality, he couldn't tell. In the stillness of that moment, before the storm of blades would begin, Peng Jial's anger warred with a growing sense of unease. He had pushed this young warrior to the edge, and now, he would see firsthand the result of that provocation. The master seated before Eunho, his eyes gleaming with nostalgia and pride as he recalled his favorite sword technique. It was the technique he had always preferred above all others, one he would undoubtedly choose if forced to pick just one. Its beauty lay in its simplicity, clean, concise, and clear, without any unnecessary flourishes or embellishments. This technique was not just a favorite, it was the first one he had ever completed, the foundation of his skill as a swordsman. The memory of mastering it still resonated deeply within him. A thought crossed his mind then. Perhaps it was finally time to give this cherished technique a proper name. His disciple, Eunho, could sense his master's emotions stirring once again. He knew this feeling well, the energy that came when his master was overwhelmed with the excitement of his craft. Eunho's silent acknowledgement did little to temper the surge of emotion. Suddenly, the master's mood shifted, an exaggerated tone of mock indignation filling the air. With a burst of energy, he jokingly accused Eunho, as if the younger man's presence and skill were a direct challenge. He playfully chastised the disciple, accusing him of greed, of wanting to take everything for himself. But beneath the jest, there was an unspoken bond between them, one forged in respect, trust, and the shared pursuit of mastery. Eunho stood firm, his eyes blazing with intensity as he prepared to unleash the technique his master had cherished above all others, the celestial blade dance. It was a technique imbued with grace and lethality, the culmination of his master's teachings, now wielded with absolute precision. The air crackled with tension as he invoked its name, sending a shockwave of recognition through the battlefield. Across from him, Peng Jile's expression twisted in disbelief and scorn. He had heard of the celestial blade dance but dismissed it as a frivolous and meaningless display of martial prowess. His contempt manifested in his own formidable counter, the celestial earth palm, a technique grounded in brute force and mastery of the earth's energy. As the two attacks were unleashed, the clash between them was immediate and violent, a surge of power and skill colliding with the ferocity of a storm. Yet, in the blink of an eye, it was clear who held the upper hand. Eunho's strike, the Cloud Cleaver strike, cut through the chaos with stunning precision. His movements were swift and fluid, effortlessly neutralizing the power of Peng Jile's attack. In one seamless motion, Eunho closed the distance between them, his sword aimed directly at Peng Jile's throat. The sheer speed of his leap was unmatched, leaving Peng Jile with no time to react. In that fleeting moment, as death's icy chill crawled over him, Peng Jile's mind raced. He couldn't believe it, he hadn't even seen the strike coming. The power and speed of Eunho's sword were beyond anything he had ever encountered, even among the revered 24 masters of the martial world. The technique before him, once thought to be a beginner's art, had ascended to heights of perfection that surpassed even the legends of the Golden Age. In his final moments of clarity, Peng Jile realized that what he had once dismissed as a simple technique had evolved into an unrivaled force of mastery. Eunho sheathed his sword with calm precision, his voice carrying both authority and finality as he spoke. The battle had ended, but he made it clear that Peng Jile should feel honored. Aside from his master, no one else had ever witnessed this powerful martial art. It was a mark of respect, even if unspoken, for an opponent worthy enough to see what few had ever lived to experience. Peng Jile, clutching his bleeding neck, struggled to understand. Defeated and humiliated, he couldn't fathom why Eunho had spared his life. The answer, however, came with a hint of irony. Eunho revealed that his master had taught him restraint, not to take lives needlessly no matter how deserving. To kill recklessly would have been beneath him. Rather than labeling Peng Jile as purely evil, Eunho saw him as a fool, misguided and blinded by his own actions. Yet the bitterness of defeat gnawed at Peng Jile. He couldn't bear the thought of surviving, humiliated by a younger, stronger opponent. Death, he thought, would be a more fitting end than enduring the shame of surrendering to someone so much younger. But Eunho's response was laced with dark humor, almost teasing. He knew the torment of death well enough and pointed out the irony, that Peng Jile, who had once protected his son without hesitation, now stood on the brink of losing everything for failing to apologize for the wrongs his son had committed. Eunho's demeanor shifted. His words were no longer playful but carried the weight of personal vengeance. His younger sister, Somi, had been dishonored by Peng Jile's son, an offense that had stained the name of Chanhejang, their family. Eunho's retaliation came not with a blade but with a sharp, effortless slap that sent Peng Jiao flying backward, a stark display of his unmatched strength. It wasn't just a physical blow. It was a symbolic punishment, a clear message of what would follow should Peng Jiao continue down his path of arrogance. With cold, measured resolve, Eunho made it clear that this was the consequence for his son's actions, the insult to Somi, the dishonor to their family, and the insult to Eunho himself. There was more at stake than a simple duel. It was a matter of pride, justice, and honor. Peng Jiao was given a grim warning. If he did not reflect on the true reason he had been spared, the next time they met, there would be no mercy. The lesson was not only in defeat but in the understanding of why death had not come to claim him yet. Hajinyu's voice rang with frustration as he reprimanded Eunho for neglecting his responsibility. His sister, Somi, had been left alone, and the concern in his tone was unmistakable. Where had Eunho been, and what had he been doing during such a crucial time? His stern demeanor reflected his anger, but Eunho barely acknowledged the scolding. Instead, Eunho's attention turned to Somi, as if his father's reprimand hadn't mattered. His expression softened toward his sister as he recalled their earlier conversation, reminding her of something he had mentioned before. Somi, ever the observant one, replied with a hint of amusement, recalling the excuse he had given. He had been suffering from an upset stomach and had stepped away to relieve himself. Hajinyu, still concerned, asked if his son was feeling any better now, though his irritation had not fully dissipated. Eunho, unfazed and calm, confirmed that he was, in fact, feeling much better after taking care of his discomfort, responding with a dry nonchalance that only further agitated his father's worry. Before any further tension could arise, a subordinate approached, bowing respectfully as he delivered a report. The preparations for their departure were complete. Hearing this, Hajinyu's focus shifted, his tone becoming authoritative once more as he acknowledged the report. The time for scolding had passed, and with matters settled, they were ready to move forward. Inside the solemn atmosphere of the morning hall, a subordinate approached with a report, his voice steady as he presented the news. He relayed the details of a written declaration left by Peng Jiao, head of the Peng family. Peng Jiao, in a move that surprised many, had taken full responsibility for the transgressions committed by his son, Peng Jiok. He requested that his son be disciplined according to the strict laws of the Namgung clan, with the hope of returning safely to Hapuk afterward. It was a gesture of humility, one that seemed to signal desperation. Namgung Jin, listening closely, couldn't help but scoff at the situation. Peng Jiao, known for his fiery temper, had clearly found himself backed into a corner with no other way out. It was a rare moment for the head of the Peng family to admit defeat so openly. The sharp tone in Namgung Jin's voice carried both amusement and disbelief, yet his curiosity was piqued. Could there be something more to this sudden change of heart? He pressed his subordinate for further details. The subordinate, hesitant but thorough, shared additional information, a rumor that had been circulating. It seemed that the young master of Chanhajang, Eunho, and Peng Jiao had ventured into the forest together. Half an hour later, Eunho returned unharmed, but Peng Jiao came back shortly afterward, appearing as though he had been through a fierce battle. The rumor suggested that Eunho had subdued Peng Jiao and taught him a harsh lesson. It was difficult to believe, yet the possibility lingered. Namgung Jin's mind drifted back to the words of his father, a man prone to using cryptic warnings to explain the intricacies of the world. His father had once spoken of a monster residing within Chanhajang, a being not to be provoked. At the time, Jin had interpreted the term monster as a metaphor for the immense financial influence of the Chanhajang family, warning against underestimating their power. But now, he recalled the piercing gaze of the young Master Eunho during their first encounter, a gaze not often seen in advanced disciples, let alone someone so young. The pieces began to fall into place in Namgung Jin's mind. If the rumors were true, if Eunho had indeed overpowered Peng Jiao, then perhaps the monster his father had spoken of wasn't a symbol of wealth or influence. Perhaps it was Eunho himself. The thought sent a chill through him as he considered the possibility that this young man, who had once seemed unassuming, might be far more dangerous and skilled than anyone had realized.